The Waco Siege, Waco, Texas, 1993. Smoke filled the sky above Waco, Texas. The once peaceful field outside the Mount Carmel compound had turned into a nightmare. Black clouds rose from the burning buildings, and the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. People were screaming, men, women, even children, as flames swallowed the wooden walls. Inside, members of the Branch Davidians ran for cover, their faces covered in ash and fear. Outside, the FBI and ATF agents took cover behind vehicles, shouting through bullhorns for everyone to surrender. It was April 19, 1993, the final day of a 51-day standoff that had gripped the entire nation. For weeks, millions of Americans had watched this story unfold on TV, wondering how it would end. Now, the end had come in fire and chaos. "Hold your fire!" someone yelled. But it was too late. The sound of explosions filled the air, followed by the loud crackle of flames. Gas tanks burst, windows shattered, and the compound collapsed in on itself. Inside those burning walls were more than 70 people, followers who believed their leader, David Koresh, was a prophet sent by God. As the fire grew, the wind carried thick smoke across the Texas plains. Reporters miles away could see the dark column rising into the sky. It was the kind of scene that made you stop breathing for a moment, because you knew you were witnessing something terrible, something that would never be forgotten. And just when it seemed like the chaos couldn't get worse, a loud explosion came from the main building, followed by silence. Then everything went black. Weeks earlier, this all began with whispers. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, known on the ATF, had been keeping an eye on a small religious group in Waco. The Branch Davidians live quietly on their own land, far from the city, following a man named David Koresh. To the outside world, he looked like an ordinary man, calm, polite, soft-spoken. But inside the compound, he ruled like a prophet. Koresh told his followers that he was chosen by God to prepare them for the end of the world. He preached that the apocalypse was near and that only those who believed in him would be saved. His words were powerful, so powerful that men and women gave up their homes, their families, and everything they owned just to follow him. But the peace inside Mount Carmel didn't last. Rumors started spreading that Koresh and his followers were building illegal weapons, powerful guns and explosives. Some said they were preparing for war with the government. The ATF took those rumors seriously. They began gathering evidence, watching from a distance, listening, waiting. By February 1993, the government had made up its mind. They would go in. On the morning of February 28, 1993, dozens of ATF agents arrived near the compound. They came in armored trucks and pickup vans, carrying rifles and wearing bulletproof vests. Reporters were tipped off, and as cameras rolled, the operation began. But something went wrong. Someone inside the compound had been warned that the agents were coming. By the time the ATF approached the gates, the Branch Davidians were ready. Shots rang out almost instantly. Nobody knows who fired first, but within seconds, both sides were trapped in a deadly firefight. Bullets flew through windows, walls splintered. Agents dove behind vehicles for cover. Inside, Koresh shouted for his followers to defend themselves. After nearly 2 hours of non-stop gunfire, the ground was littered with shell casings and shattered glass. 4 federal agents lay dead. 6 Davidians were also killed. Blood stained the dusty Texas dirt. The ATF pulled back, shocked and shaken. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance. What was supposed to be a quick operation had turned into a national crisis. That night, television screens across America showed the same image: a burning compound, helicopters hovering above, and frightened voices calling for peace. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. Was this a religious war, a police failure, or something much deeper? Then came the FBI. The standoff began. Days turned into weeks. Negotiators called the compound daily, trying to reason with Koresh. They begged him to release the women and children. At first, he did, a few at a time. But as the days went on, his messages became strange. He said God had told him to wait. He promised he would come out when the time was right. Inside, his followers sang hymns and prayed, believing his leader's words. Outside, federal agents built walls, set up floodlights, and waited for orders. The pressure grew. The nation watched, and Koresh refused to surrender. By mid-April, patience had run out. The FBI decided to act. They would end the siege once and for all, using tear gas to force everyone out. They hoped it would be peaceful, but nothing about this situation was peaceful anymore. As tanks rolled forward, the loudspeakers warned the Davidians to come out with their hands up. Instead, gunfire erupted again. Seconds later, the fire began, small at first, then raging out of control. No one knows exactly how it started. Some said it was an accident. Others believed it was intentional. But once it began, there was no stopping it. And as the flames rose higher, the world watched, live on television, as a community was destroyed before their eyes. The siege was over, but the questions were just beginning. The smoke had barely cleared over Waco when the world began asking, why? Why did so many people die that day? Why did it have to end in fire? And who was this man, David Koresh, who could convince more than 80 people, including children, to follow him into death? To understand the tragedy, we need to go back, years before the flames.
Before he called himself David Koresh, his name was Vernon Wayne Howell. He was born in 1959 in Houston, Texas. His childhood wasn't easy. His mother was only a teenager when he had him, and his father left soon after he was born. Vernon grew up poor, often alone, and searching for purpose. By his early 20s, he had found religion, and not just any religion. He joined a small Christian group called the Branch Davidians, who lived on the outskirts of Waco. They believed in the Bible's book of Revelation and thought the end of the world was near. When Vernon arrived, he was quiet, but over time, people began to notice his charisma. He could speak for hours about God, judgment, and salvation. His words were powerful, hypnotic even. He played guitar, sang songs about faith, and slowly gained followers. After a few years, Vernon claimed that God had given him a new name, David Koresh, taken from the names of King David and Cyrus the Great. He said he was chosen to open the 7 seals described in Revelation, a prophecy that would bring about the end times. Some members believed him completely. Others were unsure. But those who stayed believed they were part of something divine, something bigger than the world outside. Koresh began to reshape life inside the Mount Carmel compound. He controlled almost everything: who married whom, what people ate, what they studied, and when they could leave. He told his followers that only he could interpret God's messages. Anyone who questioned him was accused of doubting God's plan. And that plan, he said, included preparing for a final battle. So, the Branch Davidians started gathering weapons, rifles, handguns, and ammunition. They said it was for protection, but the amount they collected caught the attention of federal agents. By 1992, neighbors had begun reporting strange activity. They said they heard gunfire at night. Delivery drivers mentioned boxes marked ammunition. The ATF opened an investigation. At first, it was just surveillance, watching from a distance, gathering information. But soon the reports of illegal weapons grew stronger. A former member even warned authorities that Koresh might be preparing for something violent. Meanwhile, inside the compound, tensions were rising. Koresh preached that the government would come for them one day. He called it Babylon, a symbol of evil. He said the agents outside were soldiers of the devil, trying to destroy God's chosen people. Each sermon fueled fear. Each night, followers trained with their weapons, convinced they were defending their faith. Children were taught that outsiders were dangerous, that only life inside Mount Carmel was safe. One former member later said, "We truly believed we were preparing for the end of the world." Then came February 1993. The ATF had planned a surprise raid to arrest Koresh and search the compound for illegal weapons, but the operation was leaked. Reporters showed up early, asking questions, and someone from the media accidentally warned a Davidian member, who ran back to tell Koresh. By the time the agents arrived, the compound was ready.
Koresh reportedly stepped outside holding a gun and said, "Wait, there are women and children in here." Moments later, gunfire erupted. No one knows who fired first, but it didn't matter. The battle had begun. Agents were pinned down by heavy fire. Several were shot trying to enter the building. Others were hit as they tried to rescue their wounded teammates. Inside, Davidians shouted prayers and fired from windows. By the end of the raid, 4 agents and 6 Davidians were dead. The rest were trapped inside, along with Koresh, who had been injured in the arm inside. The government quickly realized this wasn't going to end easily. The FBI took over the operation. They surrounded the entire compound with tanks, armored vehicles, and more than 600 agents. They cut off power, blocked supplies, and set up loudspeakers that played constant messages urging Koresh to surrender. At first, Koresh spoke calmly with negotiators. He even allowed some people to leave, especially children. But over time, his tone changed. He said he was waiting for a sign from God. He claimed he couldn't surrender until he completed a special message called the 7 Seals. Negotiators tried everything. They sent him food. They let him record his sermons. They promised a fair trial, but Koresh wouldn't budge. Inside, his followers were growing weak. Food was running out. The children were crying. Yet Koresh told them to hold on, that salvation was near. As the days dragged on, the tension outside the compound grew unbearable. The media set up camp nearby. Reporters broadcast live updates every hour. Across the U.S., people debated who was to blame, the government for its aggression or Koresh for his control. Inside the FBI command post, frustration boiled over. Negotiations had gone on for 51 days with no end in sight. Some agents wanted to wait longer. Others argued it was time to take action. Finally, on April 19, 1993, the decision was made. They would use tear gas to drive everyone out. At 6 a.m., tanks moved in. Loudspeakers ordered the Davidians to surrender. "This is not an assault. We are inserting gas. Come out with your hands up." Instead, gunfire answered. The agents held their fire, continuing to pump gas into the buildings, hoping to force people out. Then, around noon, flames erupted inside. Within minutes, the compound was engulfed in fire. The heat was so intense that parts of the building collapsed in less than 10 minutes. When the flames died, the truth was devastating. More than 70 people were dead, including David Koresh and 25 children. Even seasoned investigators were shaken. "I've never seen anything like it," one FBI agent said quietly. "It was like walking into the end of the world." But as soon as the smoke cleared, the blame began. Many Americans demanded answers. How could a standoff between the government and a small religious group end in such horror? Did the FBI cause the fire, or did Koresh's followers start it themselves? The government quickly launched an investigation. The FBI insisted that they did not fire a single bullet on the final day. They said they had used only tear gas, not weapons, to try to end the siege peacefully. Their explanation was that the Davidians had chosen to set the fires themselves, a mass suicide ordered by Koresh. But others didn't believe that story. Some witnesses said they saw tanks push into the building right before the fire began. Others claimed they heard explosions that sounded like grenades. Conspiracy theories began to spread fast on TV, on radio, and later across the early days of the internet. To the public, the truth was blurry. Meanwhile, the survivors, only 9 people had made it out alive, told a different story. They said the government's actions pushed them to the edge. They claimed the tanks had knocked down walls and fired gas that made it impossible to breathe. Some said they saw flashes of light, gunfire, even though the FBI denied using weapons. But others admitted that Koresh had warned them this day would come. He told us the government would attack. When it happened, we believed it was God's will, one survivor said. Investigators later confirmed that the fire started in 3 separate locations inside the compound, almost at the same time. That suggested that some of the Davidians might have set them, but there was no clear proof of who gave the order. Koresh's body was found near the center of the compound, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. To this day, no one knows for sure if he took his own life or if one of his followers did it for him. In Washington, D.C., congressional hearings were held. Government officials defended their choices, saying they had tried to save lives, not take them. But the images from Waco, children's shoes in the ashes, tanks outside a burning church, told a different story. For many Americans, Waco Siege became a symbol of government power gone too far. People began to question whether federal agencies had used excessive force and whether religion had been unfairly targeted. The event changed the way law enforcement handled standoffs forever. New rules were written for hostage and siege situations. Negotiation, patience, and mental health specialists became key parts of crisis response. But the scars left by Waco went much deeper than policy. In the years that followed, Waco became a rallying cry for anti-government groups. Some saw the Davidians as victims of tyranny, people crushed for their beliefs. Others saw them as dangerous cultists who brought destruction upon themselves. The truth lay somewhere in between. What happened in Waco was not just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of belief, fear, and control. Koresh believed he was a prophet, chosen by God to lead his people into the end times. The government believed it was stopping a man who posed a threat to public safety. Both sides thought they were doing the right thing. And when neither would back down, tragedy followed. Years later, survivors still remember that final day with pain. One woman who escaped said softly, "We weren't bad people. We just believed in the wrong man." Another survivor said, "Waco wasn't just fire and smoke, it was the end of our world." Today, the site of the Mount Carmel compound is quiet again. Grass has grown over the ashes. A small church now stands where the old buildings once were. Visitors still come, some to pray, some to mourn, and others just to understand what happened there.
A simple memorial reads, "We will never forget." The Waco Siege remains one of America's darkest and most debated events, a story of faith and power, of hope and destruction. It reminds the world how belief, when mixed with fear, can ignite into something unstoppable. The smoke had long vanished, But the memory of Waco, Texas, 1993, refused to fade. For years after the siege, Americans struggled to make sense of what had happened. What began as a federal raid had turned into one of the most controversial tragedies in modern U.S. history. The government called it a law enforcement operation gone wrong. The survivors called it a massacre. And for many across the nation, it became a symbol of what happens when power and belief collide. In the months after the fire, investigations piled up. The FBI, ATF, and Department of Justice all launched internal reviews. Every moment, from the first gunshot to the final explosion, was analyzed, debated, and replayed in slow motion. The Treasury Department's report concluded that the ATF had mishandled the initial raid. Poor planning, lack of surprise, and leaked information turned a simple search warrant into a deadly battle. The agents had underestimated David Koresh's followers and overestimated their control. Another FBI review admitted that mistakes were made during the siege. Negotiators and tactical teams disagreed on strategy. Some wanted patience and peaceful talks. Others pushed for action. That confusion created chaos, and the final assault decision was made when everyone was exhausted. Still, both agencies denied setting the fire. The FBI claimed that the Davidians had started it themselves. But when reporters found spent government shell casings near the compound and discovered that pyrotechnic tear gas rounds had been fired that day, public trust in the official story began to crumble. By 1995, Congress held hearings on live television. Survivors testified through tears. Federal agents defended their actions with anger and regret. Viewers across the country watched lawmakers argue over who was responsible for the deaths of the children inside. One congressman said, "This was not just a tragedy, it was a national disgrace." For the families of the victims, healing never came easily. Some buried their loved ones quietly, away from cameras. Others built memorials at the site. Small stones, crosses, and pictures of smiling faces that would never grow up. The Branch Davidians who survived tried to rebuild their faith. A few returned to Mount Carmel years later, determined to restore what they called God's land. They built a new chapel on the ashes, a place where people could pray and remember without fear. But for most Americans, Waco was no longer just about religion, it was about power. Many felt that the government had become too aggressive. Others argued that Koresh's control over his followers had been abusive and dangerous. Both sides had strong emotions, and both felt betrayed.
The Waco Siege also had dangerous ripple effects. 2 years later, in 1995, a man named Timothy McVeigh carried out the Oklahoma City bombing, killing 168 people. He said he was inspired by Waco, that he wanted revenge against the government for what had happened there. That attack showed just how far the anger had spread. Waco had become more than a tragedy, it had become a warning. Law enforcement agencies began changing how they handled armed standoffs. New training emphasized patience, communication, and psychological negotiation instead of aggression. The goal was to prevent another Waco, another moment when misjudgment could lead to loss of innocent lives. Today, decades later, the questions still echo. Did David Koresh truly believe he was chosen by God? Or was he a manipulator who used faith to control his followers? Did the FBI make a tragic mistake? Or did they do everything they could to stop a man who refused to surrender? No investigation ever produced a clear answer. The truth of Waco lives somewhere in the gray space between faith and force, trust and fear. What we know for certain is that 76 people died, men, women, and children, and a nation was forever changed. The Mount Carmel site remains open to visitors. The new chapel stands quietly under the Texas sun, surrounded by fields that seem endless. There is no noise now, no gunfire, no smoke, only silence. And in that silence, the story of Waco still speaks.
It reminds America that belief can unite or destroy, and that when communication fails, tragedy takes its place. The Waco Siege was not fiction. It was a real, haunting American event that exposed the limits of faith, power, and government control. It remains one of the most unforgettable true crime tragedies in U.S. history, a moment when conviction turned to chaos and faith turned to fire. If you learned something from this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another real U.S. true crime story. Your support helps keep true stories like this alive, stories that remind us what really happened right here in America. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next real crime documentary.